So, welcome everybody. This is a panel that comes out of a workshop that we has been funded by a Shirk Connection grant that allowed Alana Glazier at St. John's University in New York City and I to bring to Carleton a group of scholars looking at domestic worker organizing in the wake of the 2011 International Labor Organization's Domestic Worker Convention. And in this roundtable, we thought we would ask a selection of them to talk about domestic worker organizing in Latin America, because they've come from so far and there's been a lot of movement and action in Latin America in that regard in the last decade or so. How have the changes affected the work conditions for domestic workers who are often marginalized women, racialized, migrant, and working class? I also want to acknowledge that Carleton University is on the unceded land of the Algonquin people and is an institution committed to knowledge and learning. We acknowledge the ways that colonization has profoundly affected ways of knowing, as well as the social relations that enabled learning and knowledge transmission and transformation. So the four people in front of us getting mic'd up are becoming cybernetic. Are Dr. María Lis, well, I'll do it in order. So on your right, Dr. Friederike Fleischer, Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology, the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And she's recently completed a study on domestic workers' experience of space and mobility in Bogota, most of whom are employed in individual households. Next, in the second red chair is Dr. Brandon Hunter-Pazzara. He's the lead labor researcher at ICF, where he's looking at electronic supply chains and worker organizations in Asia. He's also been an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University, and his research on domestic work has been on cleaners and other employees of hotels and restaurants in the tourism industry in Mexico. And so he'll speak about domestic workers who are working in institutional environments, which is quite different from those working in households, or we'll see some of the differences and similarities between them. We also have Dr. María Lis Baiocchi, a sociocultural anthropologist who researches domestic work and a domestic worker organization in Argentina. She's currently a research associate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a National Scientific and Technical Research Council, or CONICET, postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Social Research of Latin America, which is a research center of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, or FLACSO. And then finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Dario Valles with us. He's an assistant professor of Chicano-Chicana and Latino-Latina studies at California State University, Long Beach. And his research is on Mexican and Central American women who open child care centers in their homes in Los Angeles and do domestic work under the valence of micro-entrepreneurship. So we have different kinds of domestic work that are represented on the panel, and that should prompt some interesting discussions. And the moderator of our discussion, who I think is joining us via Zoom, if we could bring her up, looming over us, no, is Dr. Erynn Masi de Casanova, Professor of Sociology at the University of Cincinnati. She's the author of the book, Dust and Dignity, Domestic Employment in Contemporary Ecuador, published in 2019. And so we're really glad to have all of you with us. And I will turn it over to you, Erynn, to lead the discussion.
All right, thank you so much. This is kind of a strange situation in which I'm like the Wizard of Oz back here over everybody, but I'm really looking forward to talking to everybody and see some familiar faces. So we're going to get started with a kind of a big question about organizing and resistance. The big question is, how does the context, whether that's the social, legal, or historical context, delimit possibilities for organizing? But we're going to start a little bit more specific. And so I'd love to hear from the panelists, how does the types of work that people do affect organizing efforts? And so whoever wants to start. can answer.
Anybody wants?
Not all at once.
I can go. I can start. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, Erynn. It's good to see you.
Oh, same.
So I think that the kind of works that to address the question how the kinds of works that people affect organizing, I think household work or domestic work is a very good example of how the fact that a lot of the time the people who carry out household work, they do so behind closed doors in the isolation of a private household, where they usually have to negotiate their conditions of employment one-on-one with their employers, with whom they have very significant differences of class, sometimes race, ethnicity, gender, that differences that translate into intersectional inequalities that definitely affects the kind of organizing that takes place, because contrary to other kinds of workers, household workers or domestic workers, whichever term you prefer, they're not working, even though they belong to a collectivity of workers as household workers, that collectivity is not located in the same physical space. So you have individual workers working in individual households, which is a very different context. For example, if you think of the, I don't know, the quintessential workplace for organizing, like the factories, that you're not on the same shop floor with other people when you're a household worker. So that affects the kinds of organizing, the kinds of resistance that takes place, which I know it's one of the questions that we're going to address later, and the kinds of negotiations that are possible. So I would like to leave it at that to give room to my colleagues to also address the question.
Thank you.
So I'll go next. Just to start with, I have to say I only worked with domestic workers who work in private households, did not work with the organizations, and tried to work or interview employers, but that was really practically impossible. And also I do speak about us in Colombia because I've lived in Colombia for 20 years, even though I obviously am not Colombian. So I do think I enjoyed your breaking down these larger questions, Erynn. So that's very helpful. But I do think in the Colombian case, it kind of like connects that it is in domestic workers who work in private households, which is the situation that Lis describes. So it's this very hidden context of work, which of course then complicates organization of labor as a movement. To start with, because they might not be aware of others, there is no natural space where you confront people in the same situation to organize then and exchange information about your problems or issues. But in addition, in Colombia, because there's a very general public or distrust of other people, that these women lead a tremendously individualized life apart from the family context, which is also the other context, which is living in a highly segregated city. So they just have also no time to really organize. So that's kind of like the particularities here.
I can talk a little bit and provide a little bit of context from my field site, because I'm maybe a little bit of the odd person out here. So I work in the context of Playa del Carmen. It's a seaside. Actually, a lot of Canadians go to Playa del Carmen over Cancun. It's known as a more Canadian-centered tourism site versus the Americanized Cancun. So I worked with two labor unions, and the one relevant for this discussion was the Playa del Carmen local for the Confederación Revolucionaria de Obreros y Campesinos. It's kind of a moderate left of center large labor union in Mexico, and they have 35,000 members employed in large hotels and resorts in the area. Half of those members are women, And a lot of my interlocutors, a lot of my working class interlocutors who are women, some worked in bed making, industrial laundry, kitchen preparation. So some of the things I was thinking about with this, or why I'm here, is partly because a lot of my interlocutors were doing domestic work and thinking about their work as domestic work, but inside of the resorts. And the title of the paper that I've been discussing here, but the work is sort of something my interlocutors would say, which they said, I'd rather make beds for my kids than for tourists. And one of the reasons why they thought about their labor that way is because one of the consequences of neoliberalism in Latin America has been the retreat of the state in certain sort of social programming and the replacement of the state with jobs. And tourism is one example of this. So jobs provide a kind of social safety net for those who are able to work. And a lot of my interlocutors would work in resort work and work in hotels because entry-level jobs were really easy to get. And it was something of a social safety net. But many of my women interlocutors who are also doing domestic work, both unwaged domestic work in their households, most of the responsibilities fell on women, though that was starting to change a little bit in my own field site, but also because their own lives were sometimes precarious in the sense that they had familial obligations, community obligations, and the jobs in the resorts were fine, but not great. Many people would leave that work and do independent contracting of domestic labor in Playa itself. So because Playa del Carmen caters to a lot of foreign tourists and a lot of foreign expats, there's a huge domestic labor market working with foreigners. And that's kind of interesting because there's also a local domestic labor market working with Mexican nationals and people who are from Playa del Carmen. And in many ways, those different kinds of labor markets produce different kinds of outcomes. So a lot of my interlocutors who work for foreigners actually had a lot more power than you would think, and were actually able to sometimes organize, not in formal ways, but informally. They were able to blacklist employers or flag employers who were bad. Employers who were intransigent would get stolen from because what are they going to do? Call the police? And so a lot of times my interlocutors would enact a kind of power over foreign employers in a way that they didn't with Mexican national employers in town. But the fact that their lives or their working lives could, over say a 5-year period, go from resort work to returning to the home and working, doing unwaged domestic labor to working in independent households kind of shows you the degree of mobility in this context. And I think that hints at some of the both advantages, and we'll get into that a little bit, but also disadvantages of domestic worker organizing and domestic worker formalization. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, I wanted to first start off by thanking Dr. Ko and Dr. Glazer for organizing this panel and this entire event, and the SSHRC for funding us, and I'm very grateful to be part of this panel. I'm very humbled. I wanted to first echo what's been said in terms of why household work or domestic work is so important. The primary reason is because for so long it's been invisibilized, and this has a lot to do with notions of private and public, these private and public distinctions and notions of family, love, and intimacy that is built into sort of Western civilization, Western thought, political economy, and philosophy and family structures. And I think that all of us, myself included, are really indebted to the work of the Marxist feminist movement to really highlight the role of the household as a site of political struggle and also as a potential site for labor mobilization and social movement building, which is part of the exciting work that I think a lot of us are a part of and are seeing happening through our own work, our own research, and through the social movements that we are a part of and in solidarity with.
Thank you. Was somebody going to ask something? Okay. Yeah, I think we could also talk maybe later about whether we think that the specific tasks that workers are engaged in, whether it's care or cleaning or different kinds of actual activities, might be part of the answer to that question too. But I want to move forward a little bit. So what about demographic factors, like gender, age, race, citizenship status, of the workers that you all are studying? How do those factors affect their ability to come together and find common ground? I feel like Friederike already talked a little bit, like kind of took us into this territory. So maybe if you want to start, and then we'll see what else about that.
Great, thank you, Erynn. Well, definitely in Colombia, it's 98% women who do domestic work. So clearly gender is there on the forefront. At the same time, it's a very macho society, if you want to call it that way, or there's a very strong gender ideology expecting women to take care of the household. And so domestic workers usually not only take care paid care work, domestic work, but they also have their own households to take care of. In addition, especially in lower classes, there's a relatively high number of, in the urban context, of women who are single parents. So they go to work, have this very large commute, and then come home really late and then have to take care of their own household. So that just contributes to time poverty. And that's definitely one of the, I think, strongest elements why they would not organize, or that inhibits organizing, etc. What is interesting is that we have 2 unions in Colombia that were started by Afro-Colombian women. So I do think, I haven't done research on that, but I do suspect that race is a factor in that they are even more discriminated. As an Afro-Colombian woman, you surely are subjected to more discrimination. I would assume that that was a reason why they just said, well, this is really enough and we need to organize. So there's that threshold of race clearly plays a role in terms of discrimination. And I think that's what I can say to this.
Thank you. Who else would like to weigh in on demographic factors?
Yeah, so the demographics in the Yucatan Peninsula around both what I would maybe call like an industrialized form of, or what I'm calling an industrialized form of domestic work, which is the cleaning of resorts. You know, that labor pool was largely working class migrants from other parts of the Yucatan Peninsula who might be indigenous. At one point in time, the labor pool into this area was largely Yucatec Mayan. That's changed maybe over the last 15 years. So there were Yucatec Mayans, and then there are folks from different Mayan communities from other parts of southern Mexico, like Tzotzil-speaking Mayans. And there wasn't actually a lot of cross-indigenous racial solidarity there. In fact, those communities were oftentimes very distinct from each other. And there were a few reasons for this. There were kind of micro-class divisions. So because Yucatec Mayans have a longer history in the region, they've built a degree of middle class status that Tzotzil and other Mayans have not built, and because being newcomers. And so there were sometimes situations where you would have a Yucatec Mayan who hired somebody who was a Tzotzil speaking Mayan as a domestic worker in their homes, if we're thinking about, you know, local communities. And then most workers, I would say, would identify racially as mestizo, but would be phenotypically, you know, somebody you would code as brown, right? Who's racially brown. And this is like a concept I know other Mexican scholars who work on race have been thinking about, right? How do we come up with a new term to talk about being raced in a particular way without necessarily falling into needing to think about race in relationship only to indigenous or non-indigenous, right? And so there are new kind of terms that are emerging. But for the most part, every interlocutor that I had who performed either domestic work in resorts or domestic work for individual homes would be considered, you know, woman of color, working class woman of color, possibly bilingual, and possibly first language as indigenous. And so that creates certain kinds of challenges. I would say it creates much more challenges for the Tzotzil speaking migrants, in part because one of the advantages that Yucatec Mayans have in this area is that they oftentimes have broader social networks in Playa or in Cancun that they can draw from. And so it creates a different kind of situation, because if you have a family network you can draw from, you can leave a job, right? You can say, I'm not going to work this anymore. And in fact, this was a really big problem among at least foreigners who were hiring domestic workers was there was a constant complaint that there was a high level of absenteeism, right? Because workers would just someday say like, well, I don't want to show up and this job isn't worth it to show up and I don't have to because I have family who own homes. I have a family that can help me out a little bit. And that created a bit of leverage in a way that Tzotzil speaking minds or their migrants coming to the area from outside of the Yucatan didn't have. And that created kind of tensions within or sometimes created tensions within that particular pocket of workers that I think frustrated organizing. One of the things I write about is actually the real lack of indigenous solidarity and the lack of sort of indigenous politicizing of indigenous race relations in the Yucatan Peninsula. And one of the reasons for this is because Tzotzil speaking Mayans and Yucatec Mayans don't actually build institutions together on kind of race class grounds.
Yeah, so I would like to echo some of the things that Federica mentioned. I think that in the context where I conducted my fieldwork, which is the city of Buenos Aires, which is home to the overwhelming majority of household workers, more than half of them are located in that city in the entire country. And in that particular context of Buenos Aires, demographic factors such as class and the differences in physical location in terms where household workers live and where their workplaces are a very important factor in terms of organizing. As Federica mentioned, like the fact that a lot of them have to travel to work. Sometimes they have to commute 1 to 3 hours back and forth. That leaves them very little physical time every day for anything other than work. So in that regard, one of the tools that the organization that I collaborated over the course of my fieldwork, which is the Association of United Migrant and Refugee Women in Argentina, AMUMRA, one of the tools that they used was WhatsApp. So using the new technologies to basically communicate with workers and advise them on their labor rights and on things like salary raises, or to answer questions if they had any issues with their employers, that medium, or another in terms of class being a factor and class translating into different access to housing and to different access to different kinds of neighborhoods where household workers could afford to live. One of the things that this organization did was, when I was doing fieldwork with them, was providing capacity building workshops on labor rights and migrant rights on Saturday, which is the day where most household workers would have off. So we would go to the neighborhoods where household workers were located and carry out workshops in partnership with community organizations. So then they wouldn't have to come to the city for a workshop. We would go to them. So those are some of the ways that the organization sorted out how issues like class could be a limiting factor in terms of enabling workers to organize. And then the issue of nationality is also, I think, very important. One of the things that I found in my fieldwork is that for more recent migrants, because they weren't sometimes they weren't aware of the legal framework that regulates both household labor and also the framework that regulates migrants' rights in Argentina. They wouldn't know, they weren't aware that they would have certain rights that perhaps they didn't have in their countries of origin. It's important to note that in the context of Argentina, Argentina has a migration law that was the first. It was the first country in the world to recognize migration as a human right. So for migrant workers, many of whom become household workers when they come into the country. In fact, over 40% of migrant women are household workers. In Argentina, they come for the most part from other Latin American countries. The traditional countries where they used to come from were Bolivia, Paraguay, and Peru, and now increasingly so Venezuela, which is the most recent flow of migrants. So for them, the migration context is such that it's relatively easy compared to other contexts, such as contexts in North America or Europe, to access documentation. And it's also because the law that regulates household labor, it applies equally to Argentine nationals and to other and to migrants, particularly migrants from Mercosur, for whom is relatively easy to access documentation and to work legally in the country. So that, I think, that scenario of legality sets up a different kind of scenario compared to other contexts like the US or even here, where women who are household workers, they're not working under the threat of deportation. They're not having to face a lot of the kinds of vulnerability that they would face in other contexts where migration is criminalized. So I think that that's a very important factor in terms of the demographics and how they shape organizing or not. Yeah.
I wanted to approach this question differently and maybe ask or put out there this idea of why domestic work is gendered, or the feminine, how domestic work and household work is feminized, right? It need not be necessarily gendered, but it has become so, you know, in many contexts, in many of our contexts, and I can say that as a cisgendered male who is interested in childcare work and domestic work, you know, I often get more credit than I deserve, and that is true of many men who do domestic work, which there are. In my own field work, in the case of childcare workers and in-home childcare or family childcare centers in California, but they are often sort of celebrated and applauded, whereas, you know, the multitudes of the army of young women who do and women who do this work are sort of not given that same credit. They're assumed that it's assumed, right, that's the job, that, you know, that's the gender role that they perform. So that is to say that there are men who also do domestic work, and there are men who are interested in domestic work and studying it from a research perspective. And so my field work is a little bit different. I'm looking at this phenomenon whereby women from the global South migrate to the global North to care for the children of non-elite women, working class women, women who are on welfare to work programs, and women for whom they share often a class and racial background. They're often other immigrant women, and they do this as a micro entrepreneurial business out of their own home. And there is, you know, there are many similarities with sort of the, I would say, traditional view of domestic workers, exploitation, violence, substandard wages, invisibility. But what I am trying to do with my own research is, and these women are primarily women from Latin America, from Central America, from Mexico, who are refugees and asylum seekers. And these are oftentimes the jobs that are available to them once they migrate into the US. These are the jobs that they're, what I argue, conscripted into, right, as a job placement program, given their lack of legal status or the lack of employment, in the post-Fordist, right, era. And so what I'm interested in doing is denaturalizing this idea of the Latina child caregiver. I think that there's this it's not only a gendered assumption that women do this work, but it's also a racialized assumption that certain women, not all women, right, certain women should benefit from domestic household work and others are, you know, burdened by it, right? And that's something that you hear a lot in the sort of conventional view of domestic work, but I'm sort of kind of trying to push back and denaturalize this racialized and gendered domestic caregiver or child caregiver.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting situation where there's so many similarities between the employers and the workers, which is not the case in some of the other research that we're hearing about. So one more question about context, and this is really about the legal context. So does legislation on domestic work or the ILO Convention 189 on domestic work influence dynamics between employers and workers or shape workers' ability to make claims on employers? So that's the question. I want to leave it kind of open because I think we're dealing with different legal frameworks in different cases. Aside from the convention, which is of course a global instrument, but however we want to kind of start with that one. And maybe since we just came back this way, maybe Dario, you can start us and we'll go work our way down to Friederike.
Can you repeat the question?
So
Sorry.
the question is about how does legislation affect employer-worker relationships, and how does it shape workers' ability to make claims on employers?
So this is an exciting sort of frontier in, I think, and a thread in the research that I think a lot of us on this panel have been doing in terms of how does from a regulatory or from a labor law perspective or a policy perspective, how do we, those of us who are interested in improving the conditions of domestic workers, of household workers, and of how then do you address into policy the dilemmas and the challenges of this type of work, given that it predates, the modern nation state, it predates, and so that is, I don't pretend to have the answers, and I also think that many of the activists that I've worked with have a sort of all hands on board, all strategy approach, right? Whether it's through pushing for labor regulations encompassing domestic work into labor standards, traditional sort of labor-employer relations, legal structures and mechanisms, or whether it's sort of agitating from a social movement perspective, sort of agitating from the outside, and raising awareness or raising consciousness, raising visibility, and pushing from that end. I think there's both a sort of a complementary approach, a very statist approach, a very law and policy approach, and then on the other hand, there's also, given the nature of this type of work and the challenges of pushing for legislation and even with legislation, whether that legislation will actually impact the material conditions of these workers. I think that there's this sort of on the other hand approach of agitating from a social movement and sort of social awareness angle of it as well, which I think we're all trying to do here in this room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really important question actually, because that's one of the the advocating for changes in the law and for the ratification of the ILO Convention 189. I think that has been one of the major battles of household workers' rights organizations. Certainly the organization that I work with, they were one of the organizations that pushed really hard for legislation to change, which in fact it did in 2013 when the Argentine state recognized equal rights for household workers, or transformed their legal status from servants to workers in the law, and granted them virtually equal rights to other workers under the law. I say virtual equal rights and not equal rights because they still have what the legislation that was passed was a special labor contract regime for personnel of private households. So their labor is still not regulated under the law of labor contracts, which regulates all other kinds of activities considered work. But still, it was a huge advancement compared to what was before, which was a decree from 1956 that had been passed during a dictatorship and that severely limited the rights of household workers, and that what it did was entrenching informal ways of regulation of household work. So what the law does, to answer your question, Erynn, is providing a new frame of reference on how the worker-employer relationship should exist. It not only, I think it provides changes at different levels and it provides ways of engaging at different levels, in the sense of that it not only the legal framework of equal labor rights for household workers not only means that they are now recognized as equal subjects under labor law, and that translates into concrete labor rights that they have access to that they didn't have access to before, but it also does something else, that is introducing a new normative framework in the anthropological sense, in the sense that before this legislation was passed, I think that there was a certain framework and a certain normative framework, like that through informality was entrenched. There was a normative framework of patronage and servanthood that, in a way, sort of was based in a perpetuation of inequality and of certain places for employers and workers. And what the law does is introducing a different, not only new labor rights, but also introducing a new way to conceive of the relationship, and for workers to conceive of themselves as workers, and of employers to consider themselves as employers and not as patrones or patrons. One of the things that the organization that I did my field research with, one of their mottos was always saying that household workers, they're not servants, they're not girls who help out at home, they're not domestics, they are workers in private households. And they really emphasize this idea of worker, of using that language, which is actually the language that is used in the law that now regulates this labor. So I think that the law it does a different a number of different things. Not only in the specific case of Argentina, before legislation was passed in 2013, the rate of registration was only 6%. Now it's still low, but it's much higher than it used to be. Now it's almost 25%. There's still the rate of informality is still very high, but it's there is less informality than there used to be before the law was passed. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on that theme about the different things that law is doing, especially since I'm thinking about 3 different spaces where labor is being conducted and where is law shaping those spaces. So in the first one around resorts, the labor union had a closed shop agreement with the labor resort. And I think among hotels and resorts, the majority of the sector was organized. That's kind of important because enterprise level organizing is a very weak way of doing kind of labor organizing if you want to reshape a sector. So one of the advantages that the hotel worker union had is that so much of the sector was already heavily organized and organized under its control, that some of the policies and some of the ways it could improve the labor of even like hotel workers and lower level hotel workers like room cleaners, they could make big improvements because they had a kind of across the board or across the sector control. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to cleaning hotel rooms, right, having the door open when the room cleaning is happening so abuse doesn't happen, which is common. Creating a boundary between what guests could expect, right? Guests, obviously a hotel room isn't the same as a home, but many guests treat their hotel rooms the same as a home. And so some of that domestic negotiation, right, the labor union was able to say, well, we're going to treat these much more like workspaces than we are going to treat them like home spaces, right? Even though guests probably think of their hotel room as closer to a home space than, say, a public space or a semi-public space that thousands of guests before them have used, right? We can't have a certain intimacy. And so they had the ability to shape how the work was going to be done, on what terms, in a way that individual workers didn't. And so there are labor protections for domestic workers in Mexico. They're relatively weak. ILO did not come up at all in my field site, and in many ways, what regulated individual relationships with employers were contracts, either verbal contracts or, in some cases, written contracts. Now, this would seem like a disadvantage, and I think in most cases it is. Say, if you are in Mexico City, one of the differences in my field site was that many people worked for foreigners. And so we're able to sometimes get formal negotiating agreements, especially with, say, European or Canadian foreigners who might be hiring domestic workers. They also were able to get better salaries. But in those cases where agreements were simply verbal, one of the things workers also did, and this goes back to the point about certain levels of power that they had in the relationship, is they could simply quit or leave the relationship or exit the contract. And this oftentimes put employers at a disadvantage that could be leveraged into higher wages or better working conditions. And then there's the third space, which is unwaged domestic labor, which had no laws governing it. But I'm going to channel a little bit of my interlocutors here, which is like, if it's wrong for someone to do a 14-hour day of domestic work in a home under a wage labor system, why is a 14-hour day of mothering also not a problem? And so many of my women interlocutors would say, well, yes, the burden is on me to do most of mothering and domestic work, but I'm changing that. In my house, I'm renegotiating gender norms, right? I'm renegotiating the domestic laws in our household. And so, there was a growing culture among my interlocutors around fathers being more fatherly, fathers doing cleaning and cooking work. It wasn't just this kind of like division, this highly gender division of labor. In many cases, my interlocutors were hoping to bring new kinds of ideas of justice or law into their own homes to regulate who did most of the burdening, who carried the burden of domestic labor when it was unwaged.
I can, in a way, only reiterate what María Lis was saying. It's very similar, and it depends a lot on which level or which area you look at. From the women I worked with, I think one was formalized, and so there you can see the clear effect of this legislation. Many vaguely had an idea of what formalization is, what their legal rights were. So you can see it doesn't really translate into common knowledge, the ILO convention, and all the effective results in the Colombian legal framework. But then I do think if you look at the other side, there is a change in those terms of it does contribute to maybe very slowly changing a conception of what is domestic work from this very colonial relation of a patron and employee or even a slave to creating a certain awareness of these are workers and they should be paid. Even though the women I worked with, being of low class, often without education, not necessarily had this consciousness themselves, but there were organizations who could at least appeal to the law and say, well, we need to change this. So I think it's this kind of like secondary effect of the convention and the contract or the regulation. And I had something else that I wanted to say, which is escaping me right now. Sorry. Too many ideas. So yeah, maybe I come back to it later. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to use my moderator privilege to also answer the question. So Friederike, if you think of what you were going to say, let's pop back to you. So, I think that the legal framework, we can't talk about just the text of the laws or the regulations. We have to look at implementation and enforcement. And that's really, in my research where the government has fallen down, as far as not putting any teeth to the laws, right? The domestic worker activists that I collaborate with in Ecuador say, el papel aguanta todo, right? You can put anything on paper, but if it's not going to be enforced, then kind of there has not been in most of Latin America the political will to enforce laws that have been passed. And that's what happens when you have domestic worker employers in positions of power, right? They're even if the laws are passing, they're not super motivated to change the way that they're living their lives or the way that their kind of compatriots are. So I think that's the thing that we come to.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
I remember, sorry.
yeah.
I just want to say this kind of like officially putting the ball in the court of the state. Like it is now a regulation, and so you have to do something about it. I do think that changes the game. The effect is another one, but it does change the playing field there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it allows organizations to have something to point to, right?
Exactly.
As far as you committed to this, now let's make it happen.
Yeah.
I agree with that. So we're going to
Can
talk
I
a little bit about resistance.
Can I say something about this
yes.
point before we move
Yeah.
on? So
Right now,
in my
shout out.
in my case, in 2020, California child care workers, family child care workers, mostly Latinas, Central American, Mexican American women, formally won collective bargaining rights with the state of California. So even though they are independent, considered celebrated as entrepreneurial micro businesses, they actually were looking towards the state as their employer of record. They were demanding that the state recognize that they had a responsibility to compensate these women for doing the work, social reproductive work of raising the next generation of Californians, right? And this is a national movement. So in terms of, California is not the only state that has a unionized childcare, family childcare sector, and in California it's around 30,000 of workers. This is probably the largest group of domestic workers, formal domestic workers in any context are women who do household in-home childcare. But it's so they were able to get the state to take responsibility in the form of collective bargaining and to be the employer of record. And then in addition to that, their union is the enforcement mechanism, right? The contract that they have now with the state that they're collectively bargaining for will be enforced through sort of standard NLRB union stewards, and so that is something I think that is needed, a discussion of the role of labor unions and other civil society organizations, worker cooperatives, worker centers that can mediate between domestic workers and employers or the state in whatever situation. So
Yeah, that's a really interesting and unique case. I know that in Latin America, there's lots of domestic worker unions, but not a lot of collective bargaining. So it's like, what's the role of the union when there's no collective bargaining and no contract to be negotiated? So we're going to move to talking a little bit less about sort of organizing efforts, and to talk a little bit more about resistance in a multiplicity of ways. So the big question that we're going to take on here is, what are the different forms that resistance takes? But I'm going to break that down a little bit more. So we know that resistance can take the form of political or legal demands. We also see demands that draw on ideas of kinship or patronage, which María Lis mentioned earlier. We also know that workers can communicate resistance through language or embodied everyday practices. And so I'd like to hear from the panelists in your work, which kinds of resistance have you been documenting, and when do you see these different forms of resistance up to you? So whoever wants to take this question,
So I'll take the lead here. Since I didn't observe women in the workspace, so I can only really relate what they told me. And there wasn't much in terms of open resistance, since as we discussed this morning in Colombia, I mean, there's 50% informality. So women are very afraid of losing their job. So they don't have much possibility really to resist. And I do think the most clear point of resistance is to say, I quit. So this kind of like just saying, this is enough. And being very aware of that all the women had at least one case in their long life of being a domestic employee saying, well, that was the condition I did not accept. So, and I think that empowers them to a certain, empower with quotation marks always, but it gives them at least some resolve or yeah, and it's the ultimate gesture, I guess, or the ultimate thing to do. But they're quite aware I could, and ultimately I could quit. Apart from that, it's kind of like playing a little bit with these, like asking for time off because I have to take care of my child. Playing the informality and the not having a formal contract to their advantage. I do think that they're doing that on an everyday level, but of course that's very hard to document. It's just what they tell you, what they're doing in a workday. And I do think they're trying to make the best of their informal situation.
Yeah, in my context, I would say there are two kinds of resistance. There were sort of collective forms of resistance or collective forms of power making, and then there were individual ones. So inside hotels, for instance, if there was a kind of labor dispute or a labor problem, I also didn't observe this, but I heard stories about this of, say, bed cleaners taking, 50% longer to clean a room than normal, which totally ruins everyone's day if guests are checking in at 7 p.m. versus 3 p.m., right? And so it was those kinds of situations. I also heard of guests covering for each other when they decided to steal from tourists, which is more common than you think. So that was, I think, on the collective side. And then the union had its own ways of organizing, broader resistance in the sector, or maybe not even resistance, but actually antagonism in the sector through, protests, through strikes or short strikes, work stoppages, stuff like that. At the level of individual employers, there were a lot of things that employees did. I mean, one of the ways that you know all of the kind of forms of resistance is all the complaints that employers make. And I was on a bunch of these Facebook pages for foreigners and expats in my field site just to see how they reacted, and everything from quality of the work. So a lot of employers thought that employees didn't do their work very well as a form of resistance. Like, I'm only going to clean at 60% what you expect at 100. This is actually a thing workers do. So I have had workers confirm with me, yeah, like I didn't clean it very well because they were going to pay me regardless. So why do extra effort if it's only a one-off job? Stealing from employers was another kind of individual form of resistance. Cleaning longer than it took, putting up so there are different ways in which slowing down the work, taking from employers was common. And then in the household, a lot of women that I met would have all kinds of acts of resistance against their husbands for not doing good work. Everything from the cold shoulder and, denying the partner some degree of intimacy, to not talking, to fighting, right? As a way to push fathers to be better fathers, as a way to push husbands to do household chores that were kind of coded as male, like handyman work and stuff like that. And so negotiating in the household was also oftentimes required different kinds of acts of resistance or acts of aggression on the part of women towards their male partners.
I would like to echo some of the things that both Brandon and Friederike mentioned. I think said there are two levels that I think that we can talk about resistance in the context that I study. One is, like you said, the collective or the organizational level, to put it somehow, and the individual level. At the organization that I did my the bulk of my fieldwork with, they had one of the things that they did was which I alluded to before. They had a very strong critique of language and of the the ways in which we talk about household work. So they had a whole critique about we shouldn't talk about domestics or domestic workers or domestic employees or other ways of referring to these workers, but just use the term household worker, which would be the translation in English. And we shouldn't talk about patrons, we should patrones, we should talk about employers, or we should talk about work in private households, not domestic service or domestic work. And that whole linguistic critique, I think it was about, like I said before, start generating new meanings around household work and new ways to think of this labor and of household workers and employers in a different way, because the law, what it did, like I said before, it not only grants equal labor rights, but also it's a different way of conceiving this social relationship between workers and employers. So that was something very important to the organization that I did the bulk of my fieldwork with. And then another aspect of the organizational resistance was informing workers about their labor rights. That was very important. Providing pro bono consultations with the labor lawyer who was a volunteer of the organization, and also, like I mentioned before, carrying out capacity building workshops in which they weren't only informed in terms of their labor rights, but in terms of different strategies that they could adopt in the household in order to make sure that their rights were respected. So one of the things that they were usually advised by the activists of AMUNRA, they would tell household workers, whenever you go to a household, just make sure like the first thing you do is just take a picture, whenever there is like a utility bill or whatever comes into the household, take a picture of it so you have the exact address, of the place where you work, because sometimes like if then the relationship ends and you have to sue your employer, then like whenever we have to send like a legal notification that you are actually suing them, you have to have the exact address, or make sure that like the exact name of your employer, because a lot of the time the activists would tell them, look, like sometimes you're used to calling your employer by a nickname, and we need the actual like full name if we're going to sue them. Or they would ask them to do things like record, like sort of like hide their phone, under their shirt or something, and record them, if they like to get documentation that they were actually being employed informally. So these were all sorts of like strategies of like subterfuge that they were encouraged to engage in. And then in terms of at the individual level, in terms of like the worker and the employer, in addition to these strategies that they were encouraged by advocates to engage in, I think there are like two different groups of strategies. One of them, I think, I would say, which is not like a conscious strategy or a calculated strategy, but I'm not entirely sure it qualifies as resistance, but it is a way sometimes to access labor rights, is through the ambivalence of affective ties in the household. So a lot of the time, oftentimes it happens that these affective or intimate relationships that household workers, particularly care workers, share with the families that employ them, oftentimes can be used to the workers' detriment, where under this language of kinship, where employers say that the workers is a part of the family, that a lot of the time serves the purpose of exploitation, right? Like serves the purpose of a lack of recognition of the worker as a worker with full labor rights. But then the other side of that is that sometimes what I found, and again, I don't want to overstate this, because again, the rate of informality is 77%. So this is not I wouldn't call it a widespread strategy, but it does happen that sometimes these affective or intimate relationships can serve the purpose of workers accessing labor rights, in the sense that employers, they would register the work relationship or grant them vacation or pay for their vacation days, not just because it's the law, but because they are fond of the worker. Or I remember that there is this one a quote that I actually used in my work, that a labor lawyer once told me, that she said something like, well, sometimes they register the work relationship because they are fond of the worker. So that to me really speaks to this how the role of like affective relationships can be really a double-edged sword. And even though, like I said, oftentimes it serves the purpose of exploitation, sometimes in a minority of cases can have the opposite effect, where there isn't this clear-cut division between the contractual and the personal relationships. So that would be one side of it in terms of the individual level. And then the other one would be what like James Scott would call this use of like weapons of the weak, where workers would do things like express grievances about poor labor conditions through humor. So like through making jokes with the employer, or employing indirect communication, or using deference or cordiality, or trying to find allies in the workplace, or engage in all sorts of strategies that would prevent from an overt confrontation with employers. So that would be like to put it in a nutshell. So I think those are the different dimensions and the different levels that resistance can take. Yeah.
I'll also take this collective and sort of everyday approach. And on the collective level, even prior to unionization, the childcare childcare providers that I studied were operated for many years without collective bargaining rights. So this collective bargaining rights has only been recent, and in fact, they're still negotiating the first contract. But even prior to that, there were instances where collective action really helped shape the way that the state of California operated its childcare industry or its childcare sector. An example of this would be, there are many agencies that refer parents to childcare providers, or anybody who has children in this audience probably knows what I'm referring to. Referral agencies, I'm sure they exist in Canada as well. Mediators between parents and a childcare provider. And some of these agencies are subcontracted by the state in the sort of neoliberal era, as most state agencies are. And some of these agencies were sort of mishandling funds and stealing, for lack of a better word. The funding that was supposed to go to the childcare provider was actually not. They weren't being paid. They were being stiffed money. And so the union, one of the first things that they did was to expose some of these referral agencies for stealing government funding, which is a public benefit, really. And then the other thing is sort of an image makeover that I think the union has provided them. This idea that they are more than just babysitters, that they are not just just kind of that they're professional, that they are like workers, like any other workers that deserve to have a union. And worker labor protections. So that on the collective level has been sort of one of the main drivers of unionization, in addition to the actual material benefits that they've gotten. And then in an everyday form of resistance, I think one of the most important things that I've documented were some of the clashes that they've had with state agencies in regards to sort of proper notions of child rearing. And this sort of it spans from the food that they provide in their homes. The state often has a sort of standard of what type of food should be given to children that's nutritious, that's based on all kinds of research and techno-scientific data. But these childcare providers, most of whom are from Central America and Latin America, their diets do not necessarily align with sort of modern liberal secular notions of proper nutrition. And so some of the just the type of foods that were provided for nutrition are some examples of that. And in addition to that, there are also ideological and gendered flashpoints as well. And one of the exciting things that I've documented are this trend towards gender neutral child rearing that many of these childcare providers have been at the forefront of having to deal with this trend towards gender neutral child rearing. And so I've been looking at the way that they curate their childcare homes, the books and toys and films that they expose the children to, and their efforts to eradicate gendered stereotypes in the way that they curate their homes as sort of an everyday form of sort of resisting, social ideologies around gender and childhood.
Great, thank you. So we have one more question for the group. I say that to cue our audience members in, whether they're on person or online, but it's gonna be your turn next to ask questions and make comments. So be thinking about what you want to hear in the discussion and how you want to take part. So, are there instances when workers are expressing demands through the language of employment versus framing their demands through collective identities of ethnicity or class or gender? And the second part of this question is really the part of the question, which is which types of collective demands are most meaningful or strategic or productive in the settings where you're doing research? What kinds of demands or what kinds of framings seem to have the most weight in those settings? Whoever wants to start.
I can go. Yeah. So I think that in terms of expressing demands in terms of the language of employment, I think that is most clear when both the social and the employment relationship breaks. So this whole language of like she's like one of the family and this and that, all of that vanishes when the relationship breaks and people go back to very strict notions of worker employer, right? So that's one instance when work. I didn't do research with employers, and this is what I'm saying is something that both Kathy and another colleague have also documented in a different context, but that's something really evident, like when workers decide to sue their employers to pursue a legal claim, that's when the language of employment and the language of the law is very much used. And in terms of, can you repeat the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Well, it was just about sort of what types of demands are the most successful, I guess.
In the collectively, yeah. So in terms of like the collective demands, this would be like at the individual level, and then in terms of collective demands, I'd say that right now, because there is already in the concept where in my research, because there is already a legal framework that awards legal protection, the main demands right now are for the laws to be implemented and for the rates of registration to go up and for one of the things that household workers' rights organizations are pushing for is not only for the rates of registration to go up, for labor rights to be respected, for salaries to be higher, but also for the rates of home inspections to go up. Because right now the main way in which and we were discussing this this morning, the main way in which the states sort of make sure that the employers respect the labor laws is when the relationship ends. So when workers decide to sue the employer because they had been hired informally, or because they were fired because they became pregnant, or whatever other illegal practice employers engage in, the main way to control that doesn't happen is through really high penalties. If the workers decide to sue the employers and if they do end up winning those lawsuits or end up in settling with the employer, but one of the things that the household workers activists are pushing for, well, we need other mechanisms, like what happens when the relationship is still extant, not only when the relationship ends and you can sue, which is like a good resource, but it's not enough. They say, well, what happens in the meantime? And there are things that they suggest that could be implemented, such as doing inspections in really high income neighborhoods where it's very highly likely that there would be household workers that are working in those neighborhoods and things like that. So that would be at the collective level, I would say, the main demands.
I can go next. Yeah, in my field site, in the context of resorts, workers oftentimes call themselves workers, call themselves union members use the language, use that kind of collective language to talk about problems in the workspace. And so one of the achievements anyway, at least of the unionization process and the formalization process in the tourism sector, is that it has really gotten workers to use the language of or to use the identity of workers to ground particular claims, or use the identity of rights-bearing union holders to ground particular grievances towards the union or towards employers. In the other two cases, a lot of my interlocutors use the language of motherhood and marshaled the language of motherhood to oftentimes negotiate with private employers the ability to leave those private employers to take care of their own domestic needs and responsibilities. And in many cases, that's why a lot of my interlocutors moved from resort work into individual domestic work, was because the precarity of individual domestic work provided them often the flexibility to engage in unwaged domestic labor in their own homes. The problem with the mother discourse is something I saw, I think Sarah Luna talks about this a little bit in her own work, is that, motherhood becomes this very charged moral thing, and good mothers like to judge quote unquote bad mothers. And so you saw a lot among among a lot of my female working class interlocutors, or women identified working interlocutors, was a sense that, oh, she missed her appointment, or she missed this job because she was doing motherly work and caring for her kids. But that woman missed that job because she was on a date. Or that woman missed that job because she didn't care about her work and didn't care and isn't a good mother either, right? And so even though the language of motherhood could be very empowering for workers to use to design their own schedules and to meet their own personal needs, it also had another side to it related to domestic work, which was that it, in one way, it's renaturalized the gender division in domestic work, but it also renaturalized this, I think, very pernicious discourse of good and bad mothers in a context where, the social challenges of being a good mother were suddenly erased or suddenly invisibilized. And so that's, I think, a big challenge in some cases with domestic work, when the sort of kinship titles are being used to turn it into a positive thing.
Do you want to go next?
No, go ahead. I feel like I always
Passing the ball here. I didn't see much of a collective identity among the domestic workers I worked with. So it was, as I said, a very individualized identity and life, and not sensing we are actually part of a majority in Colombia, like all the informal workers across all the different sectors. So in that sense, for the individuals, I don't think there was any kind of collective identity in that sense of taking the struggle in those terms. But of course, for the organizations, they frame their discourse and their fights and their struggles in those terms. But again, then it falls within these other identities. Afro-Colombian domestic workers have their union, and they actually are fighting with another union, which is not Afro-Colombian women. So it might also be to the detriment, these certain aspects of this collective identity. Instead of all informal workers in Colombia, for example, organizing together, we need legislation for our rights. So it's a bit ambivalent again, coming back to ambivalence.
Yeah, that's
and I would.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I would just say that I've been interested in looking at domestic worker unionization and the way that domestic workers, once unionized, not only changed the industry itself, but also changed the labor movement and social movements, and that organized labor and social movements are having to grapple with how do we, meet the demands of this workforce that's so unlike teachers, right? Which in my case, in the case of childcare workers in Los Angeles, they're in the same union as paraprofessionals, paraeducators, teaching aides, and so seeing that sort of the awkwardness between and among the union members, and many of whom would even look down on these women as less than, or as babysitters, right, or as niñeras or nannies, which are slurs, which these providers want to turn into slurs, right, and want to eradicate that language. You know, they want the title, they want the recognition as part of the educational system and the fabric of the childcare sector.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on before to what Friederike said. I think this question of what do all informal workers have in common and how to build bridges between domestic workers and other workers who've traditionally been left out of labor unions, right? Because they don't fit the kind of like, traditional factory worker mold or whatever. I think that's a really interesting question. I hope that more scholars start to talk about that in a concrete way going forward. So I think that at this point, I'm stepping back as moderator and there's an in-person moderator who's gonna moderate the Q&A, which hopefully means y'all won't have to look at my messy office anymore. But I'm not really sure how this part is gonna work technically. So.
Yeah, thank you for navigating this kind of hybrid environment with us. I think it's gone very well so far, and you've been able to pick up on the body language and the hesitations very nicely. So thank you to all four of our panelists for leading us through these different contexts and thinking about the context of movements among household workers and the possibilities for resistance. So we may have questions online, and Erynn, I guess if you see any, feel free to articulate them. Are there any in the room here? Questions that people might pose? Yes, I will bring you. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you for the amazing presentation. It was a...
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. I'm Carolina. I'm a PhD student in the Feminist and Gender Studies department at University of Ottawa. It's the panel is highly related to my personal research, so it's very interesting to see it. I'm also from Brazil, so it also hits me personally. But one thing that I would like to question you is about outsourced workers, especially cleaning service providers, and how they could relate or participate in the struggle of unionizing domestic workers. Also, at least in Brazil right now, we are having the Uberization of domestic work, even in personal, in private households, where we have companies that kind of work as agents, but at the same time, they don't take responsibility for the workers, but they profit out of them. And this tendency of domestic workers being treated more as small business, one-person companies instead of actually workers, and the problems, the implications of unionizing and working in collaboration with them. Thank you.
Do you have a question?
Oh, it was this question of how to integrate them into the struggle.
Could you speak more about what's happening in Brazil? Because I'm familiar with Brazil, but not as much as you are. In terms of, you said Uberization?
It's
Like Uber.
the gig economy, and how this kind of work is becoming like platformized, because
Yes.
now we have, like, I think the US has a similar company, Mary Maids or something like that,
Yes.
where they kind of work as an agent, but they are not actually agents. They just connect. They are platform companies. They just connect the worker with the employer, who is not an employer in this case, who is just a person who is contracting a specific service, but actually they are performing domestic labor in the same conditions as any other domestic work. They are working for the same families, for the same households. The working situation is pretty much the same, but because of the platform they are using that mediates the employment. This is for private households, but also I was thinking also about outsourced cleaning service providers, because they also perform the same kind of work, though in universities, public sectors, government structures. So, but they are also performing domestic work, but inside an institution. And they are oftentimes one of the most precarized workers because they don't have any kind of right, because they are not linked to the organizations who are the contract is with another company, so they don't have formal employment rights in relation to where they are performing the job.
Thank you. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I'd like to take that question because I think it's really fascinating, and I think it kind of gives us an idea of maybe the next frontier, the next sort of struggles around domestic labor, because I suspect that pattern of TaskRabbit, some of these other gigified forms of labor will become much more common in this sector than they already are. And I think there are a number of ways to think about policy-wise or think about worker organizing-wise how you might take them on. I think one is you would nationalize the apps, and nationalization isn't something we've talked about in a while in Latin America, but Latin America has a long history of deploying nationalization as a strategy to deal with some of these problems. And so one suggestion has been that you nationalize Uber, that you nationalize these apps, give them to the state, and so the state simply becomes a broker of labor, because all you want is the technology to connect workers, and then you would want some kind of social safety net to protect those workers when they didn't have stable employment. And so it's really just a case for reintroducing the state as the broker of labor and nationalizing the technology produced by these technology companies. That's one way to do it. The other way, I think, is you ban it. So you should just ban gig labor. We should treat gig labor the way we treat like sex work or the way we treat like child labor. We just ban it. We're not always successful at banning it, but the fact that child labor is banned means a lot less children work than would otherwise. And so some labor organizers think, well, what you really want to do is you want to turn Uber back into taxis, right? We used to have Uber when taxis first arrived, it was Uber without the app, right? It was gig work. Taxis organized themselves into medallion systems, into unions, and then Uber and other companies came in and destroyed those systems and called it disruption. But some labor organizers say, wait, but the taxi drivers formalizing taxis was how that profession became civilized. And so we should really just be much more militant and say, we need to ban these technologies, or we need to ban the use of these technologies in this way and treat it in the same way that we would treat like child labor or forced labor.
I can take the second part of your question. I think like the context of how to encourage like household workers who carry out the cleaning or other forms of domestic work outside of the household, how to encourage them to unionize or how to organize those workers. I think that is a very like context specific question, because for example, in the case of Argentina, like household workers or women who carry out care work or cleaning work inside the private household, that would fall under a different union than people who, and I say women because it's virtually all women, like almost 100%, than women who carry out this work at a university or in another public place. So the labor is regulated differently. Like I said before, in the case of Argentina, is like it's a special labor contract regime for people who carry out household labor, and then the unions are different. So it really, yeah, I'm not entirely sure that answers your question, but I do think it's a highly context-specific question, and how that in a way, like as far as the law is concerned and as far as unions are concerned, there are different groups of workers, even though they're carrying out the same work in different kinds of locations, some of them in public spaces, some of them in private spaces. So
this isn't a new problem. It's now under the rubric of gig work, but the issue of de-skilling labor and automation has been a problem with capitalism from its inception. It's really, that's sort of the point of capitalism. But what I want to say is that from the worker perspective, there is resistance to formalizing, as you know, as Friederike was saying, sometimes there is more freedom in informality, and some of the resistance, even in my own field work with childcare businesses, that one of the fears, well, is the union now going to be our boss? You know, I like to set my own hours. I like to have my own private contracts with the parents. If we go on, will we go on strike? Right. And in their case, you know, they actually like the children and the parents. And if the parents, you know, they go on strike, then the parents will lose work. And these are parents who work for Walmart and work, you know, hourly wage jobs. And so that would hurt their clients. And there's a lot of resistance from gig workers themselves. There are a lot of problems that call for reform. But there are also a lot of, on the worker side, some, you know, and I'm totally against gig work as well. And if I could ban it, wave my magic wand, you know, but I just don't see it. It's a little bit, it's really complicated and messy, I think, right now.
If I can jump into, I haven't done research on this, so but I have two students. One did research on, we lost Erynn. Who did research on exactly one of these companies where workers then clean, for example, the university or schools, etc. And another one who did research on a, well, it's a company that now contracts domestic workers, which it then sends to individual households. And that company, both of these are very much favored by the unions, actually, and the groups and the activists. However, in the these companies that where workers then clean universities and other institutions, and in the other one, there, I mean, that takes a really Foucauldian level of training. Women are trained how to clean. You have to clean from right to left and top to down. And they are then followed by apps. Oh, you took 3 hours to clean this household, which you actually should do in 2 hours. So that's for me also this whole discussion about what does formalization really mean. I don't think that's the way where we want to go, because all the advantages that the women have in the informal context where they do kind of like juggle around, completely gone. I mean, and they are, especially in this company that sends women to the individual households, they kind of like by a point system, they almost oblige them to volunteer to work on the weekend, because if they fall down below a certain point system, then they don't get as much work sent. And that's kind of like the Uber or the delivery system again. So that's kind of like the issue, but very astonishingly that the unions actually kind of like are buddy-buddy with these companies. So there is also interesting tension there.
Well, thank you for that very interesting question that stimulated so many interesting responses.
Can I have
Is
one comment while we're still on this topic?
Yeah, please,
Right.
go ahead.
So I think that there's two like contradictory things that happen with this outsourcing of domestic work. One is a positive thing, which is it kind of disrupts the personal domination piece of domestic work, right? Where it's like one employer, one worker every day, the employer is over the worker's shoulder, right? It kind of disrupts that. A lot of times people are then cleaning a house where there's nobody in it, right? And so they don't have to deal with the employer personally at all. So that's kind of a positive thing. On the other hand, it's negative because it increases the workload, which means all the work that would normally be getting done and kind of spread out throughout the week is saved up for the worker or workers that show up to do it, right? So like then it's all the laundry, it's all the cleaning, it's piled up, right? So I see those two aspects of that kind of note that weren't addressed, and I just wanted to mention.
Can I have one more point to that too, because I think it's good, which is to say the like another kind of implication of gig work is, or at least my lawyer friends who actually practice law tell me, is, well, this system works if we all corporatize ourselves. So if I like become Brandon the corporation and I start working somewhere and you hire me as Brandon the corporation, not me as a person, right? Maybe I go to the house and I cause a fire and it burns down. Well, you could sue me as a corporation because that's who did the work. And maybe that corporation goes bankrupt, but I don't have to assume any of the debt. And so one of the things that gig work necessitates is actually that individual workers actually start should see themselves as entrepreneurs, but also corporatize themselves in a legal way to be seen as individual entrepreneurs, to avoid many of the liability problems that come with that work. Because it's often the case that these gig work apps will say, oh, well, we hired Janet and Janet burned down the house. Janet's the one liable, not us, because she was the one working there. But if Janet was in a corporation, or she was corporatized or hired as a corporation, Janet would just say, well, you can sue my corporation and it'll go bankrupt. Sorry. So some of the gig work requires actually workers to change themselves legally and not see themselves as workers, but to legally arrange themselves in a different kind of manner to adapt better to this kind of system.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. So my name's Iris. I come from Spain. I'm doing a PhD in care ethics and end of life, which is related and not related to your topic, because I'm not focusing on care work, but it also appears every once in a while. So I think there are two questions, quick ones, which are related. So the first one, something that I found interesting enough, it's that any of you have worked with employers, which sometimes I think that might also have a consequence on how you are dealing with care work or household work or different kinds of work, and how these can be understood. So, for example, I used to be a nanny of a migrant working class woman with 2 kids. In these conditions, it was like the other way around, right? I was from that country. I was just young, so I wanted extra money. And she didn't have support to have a different kind of caring for the kids. So I guess that the kind of employer that you have might also influence the kind of situation in which you deal with. And some of you have said that it also depends of if the employer was from another country or from the same country or things like that. But I would like to just have this idea of, do you think that in each of your cases, the kind of employer that you have can change the main problems, or is it just that there's lots of problems which are much the same no matter the kind of employer that you have? And the second one would be mixed with that. And my question would be, you're talking about many different kinds of work and many different personal situations. So when we try to advocate for working for rights or trying to change the systems or society or the laws, how big does the umbrella has to be? So how to deal with differences between these groups so none of the groups are unseen after this mixing, or how to defend the similarities between them? Where's the line between that? Because maybe, I don't know, if you're cleaning beds in a hotel and you have bigger possibilities to unionize with others, you might be, in fact, hiding other kinds of problems from other kinds of people. So how big do you think the umbrella should be regarding workings?
I just take it. To start with, yes, I definitely, I try to work with employers, but there's a huge resistance to agree to any interviews, etc. But from what the domestic workers I worked with report, and I mentioned this morning, in Colombia or in Bogota, I should say, they try to find foreigners to work for because they treat them better. And that is something we also talked about this morning, because there's a very naturalized class attitude in Colombia of being used to having servants. So it's very naturalized. Of course, I have somebody working for me and I can treat her badly. So that's kind of like the background there. So in that sense, yes, it does make a difference. And I do think that some of the upper classes in Colombia have this kind of like natural, well, that's my right to treat somebody that way. And in terms of what you were asking now about the category in Colombia, at least a domestic worker is quite, it's not everything. It's very clear. It's a woman I employ and she does what I tell her. She receives the kids coming back from school and takes care of them until I come home, or she cleans my car. So that's, but then there are also women who are hired as a nanny, but it's kind of like when I hire somebody, it's very clear what this person does. And so I only work with domestic workers in that sense, these for everything employees. But just to mention, because you also say you work about care, we have this, and I'm presenting at the AAA now about this new system about bringing care institutions to peripheral and marginalized populations in Bogota, and now they're taking it to the national level. And actually the domestic workers union is very clear, they don't want to be defined as care workers, because they said we have fought so hard for being recognized as domestic workers, don't throw us in with all the others, because they feel that's going to limit them. So I find that interesting in terms of these delimitations and differences between different groups.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting, or both parts of the question are really interesting. When it came to employers, I think I've already shared a little bit that foreign employers, for instance, are preferred for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. Though sometimes, Mexican nationals are also preferred because of language reasons. Because probably, maybe I don't know if this is the case, but most foreigners who live in Playa don't learn Spanish, never learn, don't have to learn Spanish to live there. Whereas maybe in Colombia, it's not the case. And so sometimes employees, or sometimes some interlocutors would describe frustration of working with someone you couldn't quite communicate with very well. And so that's maybe a difference where when you can communicate and articulate fully your whole story to your employer, you're able to say, well, I have my child and I need to take them this place. Whereas like it's much harder to just tell that to an American who has made no attempt to learn Spanish in the fields or in the playa where they live. The question of divisions is actually, I think, the central question of domestic labor, because I think there are real divisions around how it's supposed to be regulated and how we're supposed to approach it. And I think we can only see those divisions when you include unwaged domestic labor. So I'm thinking here with Kathy Weeks, right? And in many ways, a lot of my working class interlocutors were politically, or not politically, but socially conservative. That is to say, they believed that family was important, that the sanctity of family was good, that investing time in the family was important. And one of the kind of tensions in the paper that I'm working on for this is thinking about how working class conservative ideas about gender in the home run into tension with an equally potent feminist discourse in my field site around entering the tourism labor market as a way to increase your upward mobility. So, the head of the labor union's legal department was a woman who was a well-accomplished lawyer who often thought that if women just applied and worked really well in tourism, they could get education. They wouldn't have to, find themselves in the home. And she looked down on the home as a place for women to be and was kind of a feminist in that sense. Whereas a lot of my working class interlocutors would say, wait, in what world is taking care of my kid less socially valuable than serving a tourist a drink, right? Or than making a tourist to bed? And I think it was a very big indictment on, or rather my interpretation of this is like, it's quite an indictment of a kind of development feminist discourse around where women are supposed to be after a certain level of economic and educational development. And I think my conservative interlocutors would say, you're spending all of your time getting these degrees to what? Become investment bankers and destroy the world, right? Whereas like, all I want to do is take care of my kids and live a comfortable life. On some level, on a moral level, this is more valuable than what you would want to do with your education and your career. And I think those are real tensions within feminist discourse and the feminist movement. I think some of the things Kathy Weeks is putting on the table run into real problems with other kinds of feminists who are interested in other futures where maybe nobody does domestic work, or maybe only men do domestic work, or maybe domestic work is collectivized, versus folks who believe that that domestic work should be in the home, that the home is a special place, and that we should nurture that special place called the home. And I think those are kind of real tensions around some of the ways this work gets regulated and thought about.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, I did not conduct research with employers, so I cannot speak that from my own work, but I can speak about what the literature, what our colleagues who work on household work have published say that no, it's not all the same with all, like not all employers are created equal. It's not the same when the employer is another a working person who has to for example, hire a household worker to take care of their child, and because they have to go to work, than a household worker who's hired by an upper class person who doesn't have the need to engage in waged labor. It's not the same, and the relationship is not the same, and usually what some other people who work on this topic show is that the relationship is different, and sometimes that level of closeness or social closeness or distance really varies according to the social class of the employer, where if the employer feels in a way closer to the household workers in terms of class, it's a different relationship than if the employer feels further away from the household worker in terms of class. And as far as how big the umbrella should be in terms of including the workers, I think I was thinking it in terms of the context that I study. I think that the how big the umbrella can be and how demands are made, it really arises out of the needs of the context itself. Because when I think about how household workers or household workers organizations, like the organization that I work with, how they push for the promulgation of this legislation that granted the household workers equal labor rights, well, that came out of a need where there wasn't any, or rather the legislation that regulated their work was extremely precarious and really violated most of their labor rights, where that didn't happen with other workers who were already protected by very strong labor legislation. So I think that in a way, it's like the context itself determines what kinds of alliances can be made between workers and how they identify and what kind of changes they push for. And in this particular context, it made sense that they would come together as household workers or domestic workers, or however you want to call it, to push for changes in the legislation and to sort of like identify that way as a collectivity of workers, rather than thinking, well, let's think in broader terms, because the reality was that they didn't have rights that other workers did already have for many, many years. So, and they had been, legally discriminated by the state for decades. This was this legislation was from the 1950s, and only in 2013 it changed. So I think that those are the things that determine how big the umbrella is in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of employers, I would just kind of in the case of childcare home providers, which is actually very similar to the case that you're in. There are two types of parents, similar to what María Lis was saying. There are the subsidized parents, the parents that rely on a government subsidy, so the government is paying the provider to care for their child. And then there are what are called private pay parents that pay completely out of pocket. And the providers are not legally allowed to charge different rates for the private pay and the subsidized pay. So that keeps their wages low artificially. So if they, so that's sort of a structural problem within the industry that the union is trying to figure out. But in terms of the differences, they complain, both parents, there are differences, pros and cons to both types of parents. The subsidized parents are supposed to pay an extra fee on top of what the government subsidizes them. No parent ever can afford that, and the providers never really ask or charge because they know these parents are barely making it. But the private pay parents are often they often complain more about the private pay parents because they are often nurses or work in a bank or work in a school. And they often expect their little Johnny to get specialized treatment for being sort of a private paid, and they often make more demands and expect more from the provider who's trying to mitigate these inequalities, these class inequalities within their homes among the children. So So I know providers who will not allow little Johnny's mom to give little Johnny like extra $20 for them to go to see a movie or go to the amusement park. Instead, they will pay out of pocket, and they will equalize the experience for all children, so that so that the children don't see the experience the inequalities that are among the parents. So.
Erynn, I don't know, it's like we have a fifth panelist from with you, Erynn, so I don't know if you want to also address this question of, in a way, it's a question of should we be differentiating employers, and to what extent can we bringing different kinds of workers together under?
Yeah, I'm not
an
going to touch the
organized
second
umbrella?
part of the question. I think it's really complicated and it will take up all the rest of our time. But the first part of the question, I have done interviews with employers, just a handful and not a very representative group of employers, because they tended to be younger and a little bit more progressive. But the interviews that I've done with employers are just exactly like regular conversations that I have with employers, which is all about them providing an account of themselves as a good employer, and showing how they're not doing all those horrible things that people do. So, but we also have an online question. So should I go ahead and read that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is from Eileen Boris, who you may know is the pioneer of research on care work and household work. Hi, Eileen. And she says, could you discuss the impact of the pandemic on household workers in your site of study in terms of relationships with employers and state response?
Yes. Terrible, of course. Well, many women were just said, well, this is it, kind of like sewered the contract without them being paid their due fees, etc., the legally obligatory compensation. Some women being sent home saying, well, once we can come out, you can come back. But again, that left them without an income. And there were actually cases where women were given a choice. You either stay with us or you lose your job. So becoming a live-in worker. And there were some cases which I haven't experienced, but which went, of course, through the press as big cases. Women employed by a building to clean a building. There was a case, they found out there was a woman who had been locked up in the basement of the building for 2 weeks. So that was really the extreme case as a reaction. I did some follow-up research with the women I'd worked with, and it depended, and that's where the entire family context comes in so strongly. The women who had family, who had some kind of more formal employment, fared 100% better than the ones who were women without family or where everybody was in the informal employment. So that was really the difference. If they had the social family network, they somehow managed among all, but the ones who didn't have this social network just really suffered hunger. And in Colombia, it was absolutely, I'm terrible with numbers, but the amount of families who could only have 2 meals per day, it's just until today quite shocking. So,
in my field site, the large resorts were able to provide through the union some degree of support for folks, about a month's salary, so nothing too significant, but better than nothing, and certainly better than what some private employers. Because there were foreign employers, I have heard stories of foreign employers actually being quite generous with the workers they could no longer hire, or the workers they had to leave, because many foreigners who were in Playa were living there, but going back to the US when they could. And when the pandemic happened, a lot of foreigners, even who had residences in Playa, decided to return home. Some did their best to say provide a similar kind of, I don't know, would you call it a COVID bonus? That sounds like a weird word, but but a kind of COVID payment. Others did nothing, and so people were left high and dry. A lot of my interlocutors who lost work because of COVID, at least for the first 2 months, loved it. because they had all of this new time to then devote to their families, to their communities. So much of the tourism business went away, and with it, a lot of the vice economies that circulate around tourism. And so much of the crime dropped in the community. People felt like it was a much safer place to live. They were really happy to see the tourists go for a period. It didn't last that long. I mean, the market opened back up in 2021 pretty aggressively, and even in 2020, some tourists were encouraged to come down to Playa. But at least in the beginning, it was seen as a kind of like reprieve. And then the lack of state support and social support started to be felt by people. And so those with families were able to just fare a lot better than those without. And a lot of women, and this is, I think, something not written about as much, but there are actually a lot of single migrant women who come to Playa from other parts of Mexico who don't necessarily have strong kin networks and might not even have strong kin networks back home, which is part of the reason they left in the first place. And so in those cases, those women were in a real bind. That said, by 2021, 2022, the industry had kind of like boomed back because all of, I don't know, a bunch of Americans just really needed to go on vacation, I guess. And so there were actually more tourist visits in 2021 than in 2019.
Wow.
Well, Mexico didn't shut down during the pandemic. It shut down for like a week or something.
Yeah, the state of Quintana Roo was shut down for a bit, or at least there were large restrictions that were in place, at least through most of the year of 2020. But by 2021, the governor was like, we have to bring tourists back. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of, I can echo a lot of what Friederike said in terms of how the sector really plummeted during the pandemic. It was really hardly hit. But on a more hopeful note, one thing that I would like to mention, and I actually published a small, short article about this, which I can send you later if you'd like. One of the things that the pandemic did was really galvanize political action of household workers' rights activists in terms of bringing visibility to the plight of household workers during the pandemic. So as far as the organization that I work with is concerned, they did a lot of, in a way, awareness raising events, like online events, talking about the situation of household workers during the pandemic. They also did online consultations. So for example, the labor lawyer that would go to the organization physically every week, she would answer questions from workers, in terms of as far as their labor rights were concerned, online through things like Facebook Live or Instagram Live, things like that. They also helped workers access government benefits, things like there were a number of like emergency funding that was awarded by the Argentine state to people who were in vulnerable positions. So they helped them out on how to like apply for these kinds of benefits. So I think that on the as horrific as the pandemic was for the household work sector, on the more hopeful side of it, it really pushed activists to do. They were already doing a lot, but it pushed them to do even more. So not just at the national level, but there were like these events that organizations like AMUMRA were involved in. There were sometimes like regional fora where there were like household workers unions, organizations from all over Latin America or from all over the world, things like that. So and here I'm going to be because this is not something that what I'm going to mention is not something that I did research with, but I would like to mention this and unquote a really wonderful labor lawyer whose name is Mariela Pisano, who is a very strong advocate for household workers. And I heard a talk that she gave a couple weekends ago at the meeting of the Great Latin American and Caribbean Alliance of Household Workers. She was part of a panel, and she mentioned that as far as from her position as a labor lawyer is concerned, what she noticed is that one of the positive sides of COVID was that not only brought visibility, but for employers is that they finally realized what it takes to do household work. So because they didn't have access to the labor of the household workers that they usually employed. So in a way, it's like household work was in the media like it had never been before. So this is one of the things that that Mariela Pisonarius, and I think it's a very is a very interesting insight and very appropriate insight. Yeah.
In terms of in-home childcare, these childcare homes work 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They are part of like many other workers, they were categorized as essential workers, right? What is an essential worker? Who is an essential worker? But and most of their clients or the parents were also essential workers. Like I said, nurses, doctors working in the healthcare industry, food service workers, everything from high wage professionals to low wage service sector workers. So they were a major, at the forefront and bore the brunt of the pandemic. And then the unions were instrumental in them accessing benefits. U.S. There were subsidies and so much federal funding came down, and they sort of reaped some of the benefits of this. So they were able to stay afloat based on their status as essential workers. And then in addition to that, at the end of the pandemic, idea of remote workers. So those who were able to had the privilege to working from remotely, myself included, maybe many of us in this room. The question was raised as to how do we get those workers back, particularly women workers who were not coming back at the levels that they were prior to the pandemic because of household responsibilities, because of childcare and the lack thereof. And so this helped sort of raise the discussion, raise awareness of the importance of childcare as instrumental to getting women back into the workforce and away from remote work. So.
Yeah, well, thank you all. We have time for one more question if there is one in the room. Yeah, Laura.
Hi, thanks. That was a great panel. I just wanted to ask about labor reform in Mexico, of Brandon, I guess. You were talking about this union as if it's kind of a real union, even though it's and that the workers know they have a contract, and the union, there is some kind of interaction between the workers and the union, which is not the case of a lot of unions in Mexico. But there has been this process of labor law reform going on over the last several years, and a lot of it pushed by the ILO and the United States in the context of the COSMA agreement, which I've been working on. So, but it seems like the domestic labor and feminized sectors have been left out a lot of those processes, but there was pressure by feminist workers to include provisions around women workers' rights in the labor reform. So I'm just wondering if you've seen changes in labor organization as a result of that might benefit women workers, especially domestic workers.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the so when I was doing field work is when the Trump administration had ordered the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA, and so we got pressure onto Mexico to reform its labor laws to get rid of these things called sindicatos blancos, or white unions, which were essentially unions on paper, but actually had no infrastructure, no effectiveness. They were sort of agreements between employers and these shadow unions, organizations. And so a lot of what has happened over the last few years is like recertifying collective bargaining agreements to make sure that those collective bargaining agreements correspond to workers who actually want a union and union representation. And so the union that I worked with was well prepared for that. They were big critics of white unions, but their critics would call them a business union, right? I think that's a little bit pejorative and unfair, but business unionism as a kind of concept is this idea that, the union handles and manages the collective bargaining agreement. Maybe they push here or there, but they're mostly about managing employee and employer's relationship, and mostly on the side of mitigating conflict. One of the things that the union did, though, was because it was in Mexico and because it was around tourism, is because half of its members were women, and because the union also helped the state around certain kinds of development projects, is that even before women's rights and women's issues were kind of in the general ether in Mexico, say the feminist protests that started in 2019 and have continued, the union had been for a while already incorporating women's rights and women's issues into into kind of its programming and into the things that it did. So that's actually why I got to know so many women, is because I had so many events in the neighborhood, particularly geared towards women and single mothers. It had committees related to both domestic violence in the community and sexual harassment in employment. And so the union was a real progressive on this one, and they also managed a kind of anti-trafficking program that they worked with the Mexican state to enforce in the tourism regions, because trafficking was a big issue in tourism, and so they were really kind of dealing with these women's rights and women's issues. And I think that it had some kind of spill out effect on the broader kind of or the kind of individual employee domestic worker relationships, to the extent that, say, questions of sexual abuse, I'm sure that they happened, but in many ways the community was intolerant about it, right? You could find public forums where employers would post about like other bad employers they had heard about, right? So there was a certain way in which those kinds of women's issues were at the forefront. The introduction of domestic rights in sort of contemporary efforts to reform, if they're having any effect at all, it's not in Playa, it's not in the tourism sites. And this was something that I have been thinking about actually while here, which is the degree to which domestic labor, that is to say, contracted domestic labor between an employee and an employer, the sort of individual household domestic labor, really law is not there at all. I mean, legal law is not there at all, but other kinds of law is. And I find it really interesting that in a space where actually the conditions seem pretty ripe to formalize this otherwise informal sector, they haven't taken place. And so I wonder, or I've been wondering a little bit, if it's partly because not everyone's actually interested in formalizing this kind of domestic labor for some of the reasons you've mentioned, some of the reasons we've talked about earlier, that formality, labor rights, that kind of language, that kind of discourse, that kind of possibility isn't necessarily as appealing or isn't galvanizing enough for workers, at least in that context, to care about. I'm sure in other parts of Mexico, say Mexico City or somewhat more urban contexts where the majority of the clientele might be Mexican nationals, and it might be thought of as a more traditional labor kind of situation or a more traditional labor dynamic. I think that's probably a place where you're going to see something different. I think probably because there's so many employers who are from foreign countries and willing to pay above market rates, above national market rates, you've really kind of defanged any or neutered any impulse to organize the industry any further.
Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel and our discussants. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to take a break of half an hour. There is some food and drink out there, and feel free to, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, to have a conversation. And then we're going to regroup at 5:30 and hear the keynote by Jean-Francois Mayer, who has joined us. So we're very glad he made it here. So go
Thank
off
you.
and enjoy and
Thank you.
refresh
Thank you.
yourself, and please come back.
We have to